So, hello and welcome to the Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues in learning design and examine the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. So today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Phil Gaunt, my Director of Learning Design at Ding Learning, and by James Cotton, who is the co-founder of ioSphere. Now, ioSphere is a 10-week experience accelerator. James, you're going to have to correct me on this because I'm going to get it wrong, but it helps exceptional individuals into data-focused roles. So welcome, Phil and James. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for having us.
It would be useful, I think, to kick off with a little explanation, James, of what is ioSphere. So obviously you've been running ioSphere for about a year, but what is it exactly? What do you do at ioSphere?
So at ioSphere, we run intensive training programs, which are designed to help people get either into data or to take the next step in their career in data. We do it in quite a different way. And you could argue better, but I'm not going to make that kind of statement in terms of how traditional education programs are run when it comes to data and just getting people into careers in general. A few differences being that it is really intense. We have purposely compressed it down into 10 weeks to get people through, trained up and back out on the job market as quickly as possible. We've also taken a very different approach to how it is that we have built the program, really with the focus being on being able to get people into jobs at the end of the program. So we focus on giving them the experience that they need and able to get through the interview processes and impress the employers, because to be able to show they have the right skills, basically.
Amazing. So there's a load of stuff in there to unpack, and you mentioned the idea of duration, which is what we'll come on to. So obviously the title of this podcast is How Long Should a Course Be? And this builds on some of the conversations that Phil and I have been having around the role of duration in learning design and being quite intentional about it and saying, well, how long does this experience actually need to be? So we'll come on to all that and how long a course needs to be. But could you start also by telling us a little bit about what drove your idea for ioSphere? Because, there's a ton of courses out there already. There's lots of courses to train data analysts. So what made you want to do it differently? What was your main idea?
There's a few different ideas. And my co-founder, his background is mostly, Oscar, his background is mostly training, learning, and development. And my background is actually in industry itself, working and building out of data analytics pricing type of teams. And what's really interesting in this space in particular, and I think probably does apply to other spaces we just haven't explored yet, is that the mismatch between what current education delivers and what people actually need and employers need is actually humongous. The gulf between them is really, really wide. And what I mean by that is that, like most of your traditional university programs or actually boot camps or all of these different programs that are out there, what they tend to focus on is giving people technical skills in the context which is not actually that useful for them to be able to understand how they've applied them, and technical skills that are actually just never ever used in the real world. And so there's this huge mismatch between what it is that they're teaching and training and educating on and what people actually need. One of my favorite examples that I always tend to use is the concept of deep learning, which is like the thing which is behind Google search. It's an incredibly complicated mathematical thing. It is very difficult, and nobody works in it. I mean, people love the idea of it. And there are definitely jobs at Google that work in deep learning, and there are companies that are exploring it and that kind of thing. The modern day one actually is probably the large language models like ChatGPT. But the reality is there are very few entry-level programs where people are working on these kinds of models and entry-level roles. And so if you're training entry-level people in these short or even like mid or long-term programs on these things, you're setting an expectation that, one, they'll be working on that in their job, but also when they get to the interviewer is like, you're not going to do any deep learning. We don't do any deep learning. I don't understand what you're talking about here. And so what's interesting is when you're a hiring manager, back when I was working at Expedia or World Dream It, you've got all these people coming through these degree programs or boot camps or things like that. And they're like, look at my great CV. I can build you a great deep learning model. And you're like, literally nobody does that. And so you don't actually have the skills, technical or the experience working with real data that you need to be able to get a job here or kind of anywhere else. And so that's what we really tried to redo from the training standpoint at ioSphere. Instead of being like a traditional classroom with a teacher and like really clean, antiseptic assignments, what we do is we have basically created a full fake company called Prism, which Phil knows really well about. And the idea is that instead of just coming to learn from us, they actually come to work for us for a period of 10 weeks, which means that we can give them not only the technical skills that they require, and actually one of the interesting things about our programs, we've actually partnered with a third party to deliver a lot of that stuff because it's kind of commoditized. But we can also give them the hands-on experience that they working with real data in a realistic environment. We can build up their business acumen, their soft skills, and their professional skills, which means by the end of the program, they're actually able to, one, confidently interview for jobs, but more importantly, when they get into those jobs, they have the right expectations and they can confidently hit the ground running.
Amazing. Thanks, James. That's a great insight into iosphere and what you do. Phil, can I come to you? Because obviously you had a lot of experience in running a very durationally focused program, a much longer 3 years program as a course leader, and also preparing graduates for employment. So what's your take on the iosphere model and this role of duration, sort of short versus long?
Well, there's a lot of what James was saying was really chiming with me, because I remember that in year 3 of a sort of the undergraduate program, there would suddenly be this flurry of curricular-based activity around CV writing or getting ready for the workplace. And it always felt like it was always very well intentioned and always run by, great people. But there was a slight sense of, we've got to do that now. And I think the thing I really want to pick up actually on what James was talking about was that really lovely use of language you used about how one of the things that you have been interested in is sort of challenging that sort of the antiseptic environment of universities. That idea that sort of whilst they are delivering a lot of content, they're delivering it in a way that doesn't completely or ever align with the way in which problems actually arrive with people. Would that am I understanding you correctly by your use of the word sort of antiseptic and working against that sort of that problem?
That's exactly it, because in the university setting in particular, and this is one of the challenges that we have with students coming from like kind of straight out of education, is that there's a few things which are perpetuated. One is that there is a right answer to problems, and actually in the real world, you don't know if you've got the right answer to a lot of things. The second thing is that like when you're solving a problem, everything is available to you at that point in time. Here's the data that you need, here's the question, here's the background reading, go and solve it and I'll tell you if you got it right or wrong. I don't know how many real world problems are actually like that. No, you need to go do your own research, you need to talk to people, you need to understand what information is available, you need to understand what you have available in terms of, in our particular case, data, and what's wrong with it and what's right with it, because it's not going to be perfect. And then once you've been able to take all that together and kind of think it through, which I think is an important thing, what do you actually do with it? Which is, you don't just submit it in an assignment, waiting to be marked. Like you need to champion the own value of your own work.
I mean, that's so interesting. It's that idea of you're sort of seeking to produce a sort of a less safe, less singular experience. In other words, you're saying, no, actually, any one decision is plural. It can have multiple effects. You've got to kind of stay with your decision. You've got to kind of be its custodian. You've got to be its champion. It doesn't just stop when you get a grade. So these are all characteristics of the workplace that the university really does struggle to reproduce, because you're also seeking often sort of in HE to produce the conditions where learners feel safe to make mistakes, or where they're just learning they're often working with their anxieties around their performance, and they've obviously come from environments where they've been told to get the grade, to do well, to be conscientious. And I think it's very interesting that you're picking up on a tension between some of those kind of more schooled behaviours and the actual workplace behaviours that you're looking for. And that's another one of the tensions, right there.
Completely. It's one of the reasons why, like, if you kind of just break it down fundamentally, we could train people how to do components of a job, or we could just train them to do the job itself, which is the approach that we've taken. One way I think about breaking it down is like, if you were going to learn how to bake a cake, you would probably go into a kitchen, ideally with somebody who knows what they're doing, and just have a go at it. Probably screw it up the first few times, but build up your experience, ask them, learn as you're going on the bits that you don't understand, and get your hands actually dirty. And that's the approach that we take at iosphere. It's one of the reasons that we insist that all of our coaches actually come from industry, have done the job themselves, and they know what it's really like out there in the real world. Instead, what everybody else seems to be doing is like, you need to take a full year's worth of lectures on like the history of agriculture in Europe to figure out where the wheat comes from. You need to do some kind of like weird mechanical course in terms of understanding how it is like an egg beater might work and all that kind of thing. And again, you're supposed to understand how to make a cake. And they're just like kind of fundamentally different things to me. I was just going to say, on the topic of psychological safety, though, I think that's quite interesting. And actually, you guys probably have a lot more information than I do on it. But we have this like tension within our own program, which is like, we want people to feel safe because this is an incredibly safe environment. There's going to be no safer environment for you to be able to make a mistake. And by making a mistake, you're probably going to learn 10 times what you ever learned before. But you also shouldn't feel safe. Like, you shouldn't feel comfortable. You should feel consistently uncomfortable the entire time, because that probably means you're learning the most. And how you manage that tension is actually kind of tricky.
Again, and I know Tony's going to want to talk about, because I think duration is part of that, because I think the idea of the speed, the lick at which things go, can often be for a learner's like a pain center. It can produce anxiety, and it can prohibit learning because people feel that they're being overwhelmed, or they're not being given time to be perfect, and all of those things. So I know that Tony's going to get into that, but I'm a lot of what you're saying there about the ways in which psychological safety and discomfort, or being uncomforted, they look like contradictions. They look like you can't have one without the other. But that chimes a lot with the conversations I was having a long time ago, where I was seeking to produce the conditions for uncomfort in students. In other words, to move them to places that they weren't comfortable with and confront them with things that were not comfortable, at the same time as making the distinction that I wasn't torturing them or or somehow being irresponsible or any of those things. But I think that tension, particularly with what you're trying to do around mimicking or producing the turbulence of the workplace, bringing in that boisterousness, the imperfection of interactions, not because you don't know what you're doing, but because you know exactly what you are doing. And I think that's a very interesting learning design space. I think a lot of people would walk into that with some worry. Personally, I just think it's doable, and it's an exciting space, really, to be honest.
I agree. One of my favorite things that we do on the course is that actually it is not possible, well, with a few exceptions, it is, for the big projects that we run in the second half of the apply portion of the course, it is not really possible to actually answer the question properly of any of the projects that they do in the time period that they have available to them. That means that for every single project, they have to make decisions about how they're going to effectively structure that problem down and be able to answer it by a given deadline. Imperfectly. I can't even say it out loud. Yeah. And the best thing is that if you have 3 teams working on the same project, you're going to have 3 different answers. And now we can have a real conversation about, like, so what do we do now? What happens next? Who's right?
That's really interesting, because it feels like that. Yeah, with my academic hat on or learning design hat on, you'd be looking at the outcomes, and usually the learning outcomes will be very clear around, to complete this project, you need to do this. But actually, what you're saying is one of the learning outcomes here is much more about, you're not going to complete this project. So the learning is actually, how do you manage that incompleteness? How do you manage that tension and that pressure and the other things that get thrown at you? That's the actual learning. It's less about delivering the project. It's more about managing your approach to delivering the project.
Exactly. Our projects are purposely open-ended and ambiguous, which is one of my favorite things of saying to the students each and every week.
So do you think then, because as I said, there's a lot of courses out there, university courses, 3-year courses that do this, but in a very different way. So in your experience, because you've been running this for over a year now, are you trying, or is it possible to learn as much in 10 weeks as in 3 years, or are you not trying to do that? Or what's the do you think the 10 weeks is enough to teach students what they need, and how do you mitigate that? Is that to do with who you admit onto the course, or how do you balance that tension?
I think it all depends very much on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. I think one of the things which is super interesting about universities in particular is that, they're not solving for the length of the program, they're back solving for the length of the program, which is that they have a period of time and that they therefore need to fill, which is very different than being like, actually, what is the minimum amount of time that I need in order to achieve an outcome that I want. Now, our program right now is a little bit different than most in that we're super selective in terms of who it is that we let on the program. Why? It's because actually we have also a very different financial model than traditional education establishments. For everybody that comes on our full-time intensive programs, we fund all the upfront costs of their training. We actually we invested £1.2 million in people's training last year.
Wow.
And then we guarantee that everybody who comes on the program will get a job offer within 6 months of graduating, or their training will be completely free. So that means that we're all 100% focused on the only thing that actually matters, which is the outcome, which is actually the job offer that the candidate is going after.
Sure.
What that means, though, from a duration perspective, is actually so we have the benefit of being able to be selective in terms of the type of people that we come on, but we're not checking actually usually for like the things people would classically think of from data jobs, which are like mathematical skills. You have to have them, but like it's not the be all and end all for us. We check for the things we can't teach on the course. Collaborate, like we do a little bit around collaboration, but you need naturally collaborative people. You need curious people. You need people who are humble and willing to learn, that speak English well and have the right to work and that kind of thing. What we did though, is that we've compressed and we made an intensive part of the program. This is where they come in and they get the base level of knowledge that they need to be able to interview confidently for jobs and actually go get those jobs. That's why we have a 92% success rate, I would just like to say. Little shameless plug for us.
They got a shameless
Everybody here. Again.
Get those plug there.
What we've done though is
I didn't quite catch that, James. Could you just like
92%? Yeah, our first cohort, 92% of them got job offers in data within 6 months of graduating.
Amazing.
Now, what's interesting though is like what we've done is we've got this intensive program where they're with us, and we just we give them a lot of feedback. We do a lot with them. It's like, to be honest, it's beyond full time. So like they're full time with us, but then they're doing work outside of those hours in order to keep going. And actually, during that period, we can take them from here to here. Like there's an astronomical change in behavior and outcomes over that time period. But we also know that some of the things like technical skills require lots of practice. You need to build up. There's lots of different things that different people are interested in. We know that some of the skills, even just around interviewing and how to go about doing a job search, are not things that we can fully cover within that time period. So what we've done then is we've made we continue to support our students for 6 months after the program ends, and it's a little bit lighter touch. So then they only meet with us and a career coach once a week to make sure that the job search is going well. We do interview practice with them. But most importantly, I think from a data and technical perspective is, and I kind of hinted at it earlier, but so we've actually taken basically the whole technical curriculum and outsourced it to a third-party platform, DataCamp, because they have honestly excellent online interactive coding and technical sessions. People can do it at their own pace, on their own like at whatever time they want to do it on. They can go back and they can repeat things. It's what allows us to have PhDs alongside people who have not gone to university in the same program, and everybody is challenged throughout it. They keep that for 6 months after graduating, which means that as soon as they're done the intensive part of the program where we've built up the experience, we've given them all the tools that they need, they then can go out and on their own time continue to build up their technical experience. I'm not sure that answered the question, but I talked a lot.
No, it was interesting.
Well, sorry.
No, go on, for you go.
I was just going to say that because obviously, you know, when we're thinking about duration, perhaps we're thinking about it in quite a sort of we're thinking about it sort of horizontally. So it's like 10 weeks, but actually you're describing quite a sort of a vertical experience because you've got sort of like a huge and intensive emphasis on formative feedback. You've got a relationship and an attitude to your recruitment. So you've got some ideas about recruitment. You've also got this sort of 6 month period afterwards where you catch up with people and you look after. So in a way, although the course is 10 weeks, it's actually scaffolded by this idea about recruitment. So the bit before, and it's also scaffolded by a commitment to the bit afterwards. And I think that's fascinating. Certainly, when I think about some of the challenges durationally around universities, where perhaps you might say that some universities that I'm familiar with don't give as much thought to the recruitment side in that respect. So they're not thinking about that. They don't have an attitude about that, apart from the fact that they just need sort of like the bums on seats. So maybe the argument for like that 3 years is because they're not making decisions, very good decisions around the recruitment. So they've got to do a lot of work that perhaps is not completely associated with getting them out. It's to do with kind of bringing people up or leveling up or all of those things. But it would be a misnomer to think about your course as a 10-week slot. It's actually more expansive in both directions, right?
Yes, I think that's really fair. I also think, just as a little aside and rant on the whole university thing.
Yeah, go rant.
And the duration that exists there. If you were to optimize that problem today from any perspective other than sort of a well-off, wealthy elite perspective who can afford both time and money, you would probably never come up with the same approach that you have right now. What do I mean by that is that, like, if you think about the return on investment of education, we know what the return on is, which is the outcome that they're going to be able to get that they can't currently get off the back of it, which is going to be some kind of job with a career and future associated with that. And we know that there's tons of programs that have very low outcomes. We also know that there are programs that have good outcomes. But in terms of the input that goes into it, there's kind of two main ones that students are giving. One is around the cost. They're paying £9,250, I believe. That's the number, right? for 3 years. So they're paying almost £30,000 in tuition, which is, okay, a lot of money. It's actually 6 times what it is we charge. We deliver 400 teaching hours, plus all of the stuff before and after. But then you look at the time side of things. Now, if you were taking an arts degree, you're getting something in the range of like 3 hours of teaching over 7 months a year, 3 hours a week over 7 months a year. So like, I don't know. Okay, even if you like double it, you get like a couple hundred hours of teaching. And they're doing that at double the price. But more importantly, from a time and duration perspective, that means they're out of the job market for 3 full years. And so there's a huge opportunity cost in terms of how it is that students should be thinking about their education from that perspective. So you're just paying a lot of money, not getting a lot in return. And then you're spending a lot of time on it with these huge breaks that don't necessarily need to be there. You could, in theory, redesign a lot of these university programs and make them much more intense and short. You get rid of the summer breaks, you get rid of all the breaks in the middle of the courses. You make them actually work like 40 or 50 hours a week like you would in a real job. And you could probably take most of those degrees and you can compress them down into, I don't know, 18 months or something like that. What's interesting then is even if you don't change the actual cost of the program, you get 18 more months of earning potential off the back of it, which you completely offset like some of the additional costs that you're getting right now.
Yeah, that's super interesting, isn't it? It's like you say, if you rethink the model from scratch, it's like, why would you design it that way? Why are there so many gaps? And more importantly, now because of the cost of it, what is, as you said, the opportunity cost of not being in the job market? That's 18 months at least earning potential that you're not getting. So my next question is, what do your students think? Because I mean, this is such a different model, the one that which you've developed at Iosphere from a university degree, but you obviously have grads coming onto your program, so that when they get to experience the difference. They've had a 3-year degree and now they have a 10-week experience. What do they think about this idea of duration? What's been some of the feedback that you got from them? Do they find it overwhelming, or is it what do they think about it?
You kind of hit on actually a few of the different points already in your question. So one, I think on average they like the idea that it's short and fast and intense and you're back out onto the job market. That kind of resonates with most people. With a few exceptions, if you do have like heavy carrying responsibilities and that kind of thing, in which case it can be quite tricky. So that's why we're trying to do a lighter touch, longer term program that's part-time. But that being said, a lot of people, particularly those coming out of education and not coming out of a job, they take the first couple of, they struggle in the first couple of weeks. They're not used to the idea actually that like, no, when we start on Monday morning, like you're going to have 40 hours worth of content, which means that if you have not done it by next Monday, you now have, say you only did 20 hours in your first week. Now you've got 60 hours the next week. And it just keeps adding and adding and compounding and compounding and compounding. And I think, there's different lengths you could have around this kind of program, but I feel quite confident by the end of 10 weeks, almost every student that we've had is like, they need a break by that point because we push them really hard. It's a full-time job. Like it's full days, and they're thinking and learning and trying new things the whole time. And so by the end of the 10 weeks, they're kind of, I'm ready for a little break.
Can I ask you a question to advocate in the other direction? So from knowing what you know, can I ask you to advocate for duration? So let's start from the start point that 3 years does make sense. Like what might be the benefits of a 3-year sort of like educational experience? Because I can hear there's like an imaginary audience, a bit like in the Muppets, you've got Statler and Waldorf, haven't you, in the Muppets? And I've got this imaginary balcony with loads of people in there going, but who are worrying about the notion of acceleration, also worrying about all of our conversations around the value of education being about jobs and salary, whereas there's probably an established argument that says that that's an imposition, that education is a broader goal than all of those things. So if you had to sort of go on the other side in the courtroom and defend a 3-year degree, what argument might you make for it? Just out of interest.
There's only one real argument that I can make, which I'll make in a second. But I do think that the overall question that was like, it comes from this position of like people who can afford the time and the money from the very, very beginning. Because also the similar idea that like there's a value in education for education's sake, which is learning things. I completely agree. if you do not have like pressure around the fact that you need to feed and house yourself. And also you probably like whether or not you want to take on 30,000 pounds of debt in order to do this kind of thing, because that could be quite a long time to pay off. I think that the biggest, okay, no, actually, because one is actually education for education's sake, which I can get, but I can get that in an environment which is like, for example, in the EU, where your education is going to be free. So yes, you don't pay for it, but there's value in you learning it. Okay, fine. The other one is there's value in maturing or growing up, which people often say, which you do incidentally in the same years, and you have a little bit of independence. I think if that is the goal, then make that the goal. See, I'm already undermining myself. You know what I mean? Like, if the goal is for you to go from being a teenager in school in order to being a working professional, contributing member of society, then like, I don't know, teach them that specific thing. Or find a way of doing that where you're not taking 3 years out of your job market, and so you're giving up all these earnings and taking on all this debt, which means your total like cumulative.
I think you did a really, you've done a very interesting thing there, because I think that classic idea of like, ask for what you want and to design for it. The idea that if this 3 years is actually about maturation and sort of the learning design is durational because it's about what you're like after 3 years, then that's a completely different beast to let's try and teach data in 3 years. But the other thing, I think the point you've made really eloquently, is a big social justice piece in there around duration and privilege. That's one of the sort of the unspoken presumptions around an older idea. This sort of, as you said, now you wouldn't design it in that way, and it's definitely got, the way you express it there is that, sure, time is money, and if you don't have to worry about money, then you don't really have to worry about time, do you? You can just have that 3 years. So I think that is a fascinating sort of and provocative insight, because I think everyone is thinking more and more and more about leveling up and how you sort of can mitigate privilege, or the way that privilege can work against exceptional people who come from non-traditional backgrounds, etc., etc. So yeah, that's a point well made, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a thought or an idea, which is like, what are you trying to, like, in terms of the courses that you're building and designing in different programs, what are you trying to achieve? And then there's like this sort of philosophical question, which is like, are we trying to achieve thoroughness and completeness? Or are we trying to achieve the minimum possible of input that we can put in order to achieve an output? And like, if you were an economist or you were doing some kind of rational economic exercise, that's what you would do, right? You'd be like, okay, what is the lowest possible cost that I can take in order to get the maximum possible benefit? But that's not what we offer people. We say, you take full cost at my entire discretion, and then you potentially get the benefit, but I don't actually care too much about the benefit because I only care about you taking the full cost, which is weird.
Can I just pick up on your point about, you mentioned, the value of learning for learning's sake, which again, I'm totally all behind. I think, learning can be a fantastic, broad, immersive experience, and it can take as long as it needs to. But when you were building and scoping ISV, you obviously had a lot of conversations with employers. And I suppose my question is, what did employers tell you that they wanted? Because it strikes me that universities are, with this model, this 3 years, they are taking students from 18 to 21, which is, there's a lot of emotional development that needs to happen there. And ideally, they produce people who are well-rounded individuals with knowledge and skills relevant to enter the job market. But that's all very well. But you talk to a lot of employers, and you do it on a regular basis. What do they actually tell you that they want from a graduate?
Okay, this is like a totally random aside, but I feel the need to say it. Like, if the universities were actually trying to produce people who are like well-rounded people, they would probably mean that every graduate should know how to like do budget and what compound interest actually means for their like retirement savings and all of this kind of stuff. And like, so that would be, like, you could design that into a course which just runs through the whole thing. And sorry, I got distracted by the actual question. Oh,
life skills.
What do employers tell you that, like, I have a job? Why don't you just tell me to do? Why don't you give me a whole bunch of people that you've kind of pre-filtered that actually know what the job is going to be like? And that is like, and jobs are not composed of only this like very narrow set of technical skills where like people, in a university environment, in all reality, and in a normal boot camp, right? Like, the students set the curriculum because they choose what they want to study. and they choose which institution they go to. Like, there's a few that obviously people will go to, but if you're outside of the top like 10 in the UK or something like that, you're more or less competing in this market based on the like coolness of your program. And so students are in effect telling people what they want to learn. If that makes sense, right? And employers are sitting there and going like, okay, great, you can go and learn all that stuff all you want to, but actually you're going to do none of that in your job. What I would really like is if you just knew how to do the job. And so when people often come to us and they're like, so how do you do that? Like, what do you do? It's like, well, imagine the thing that you found really annoying in your job today. We probably just made that an assignment. Do you know what I mean? It's like one of my, like at the very beginning of the program, like one of the things which shocks a lot of people into like paying attention is that we basically just give them, like at 10 a.m. We give them an email, which is like, I need this number by noon. I'm going into a meeting. Please go do it. And then they realize actually that even though they just did all this stuff, they have absolutely no idea how to deliver that. And so like, you can kind of just build those things in. I'm not sure I answered your question very well though. like a great example in data, there's all these like really cool models that people can build. Everybody hears about AI and machine learning and that kind of stuff right now. Building a model these days is actually incredibly easy to some degree. There are complicated ones, there are niche use cases, all that kind of thing. There are actually whole companies that have built things built a product called AutoML, which is like, we can build you machine learning models without you having to do anything. We've automated the entire process. And so that means like if learning how to build and how the like minute details of how those models work under the hood does not feel like a particularly durable skill. It's also not a particularly hard skill because you can do it in 2 or 3 lines of code. You don't even need to learn how to do the code. You can just copy and paste it from ChatGPT. Now, you know what is really hard? Understanding the business, understanding the stakeholders that are involved, trying to understand where you're going to get the data to put into your model, trying to understand how you're going to check the data to make sure that it's right in case engineering teams or other teams make changes upstream, how you're going to make sure that the outputs of your model make sense, how you're going to make sure that it's compliant if somebody lodges a complaint under GDPR, how you're going to actually take the model once you've built it and put it into production so that somebody actually uses it. And even if they do use it, how you're going to make sure that they understand what they did. All that is really hard. And none of that is covered in a traditional programmer bootcamp.
Okay, that's interesting you mentioned that, and we're getting slightly off duration, but I sort of in many ways wanted to get here, which is my final question really, which is around this idea of personalization and professionalization, and you've intimated it there that there seems to be quite a trend in learning design at the moment. So one of the big trends for 2024 was personalized learning and personalized learning paths, and they say, ooh, yeah, why wouldn't you want that? And yet, as you say, when that graduate enters a business, it's not really about them. It's about what the business needs. And so what is your view on personalization versus professionalization?
I think excellent question. So one, like if you want a job at a company, you have to be able to do that job. The whole point of the interview process, CV application, all the training that you did before that is to be able to convince the individual who's going to hire you that you have the capability to do that job so they no longer have to deal with it, which I think is an important frame of mind. I lost my train of thought right there.
Personalization versus professionalization.
Personalization. Now, that being said, there are lots of companies and lots of jobs that are out there, and different people are going to be interested in different things at different points in time. And so you have to be able to accommodate for that if you want to make a reasonably attractive program to a bunch of different people.
Sure.
You know, there are people who come from our program and they go into charities, some go into transportation, some go into consulting. Some go into all sorts of different things. They go into different types of roles. Are they analyzing marketing? Are they going into more of a project management type of role? Are they working with product teams? Are they working with all sorts of different finance teams? I don't know. It doesn't matter. And the point is, all of that is, in my mind, personalization, which is, you have to have the freedom within what it is that you're studying and the content that you're giving people to learn about the things that are actually interesting to them, which will lead to a job. You get one part of that.
Yep.
And actually, a lot of that we are able to deliver, as I said, with our partnership with DataCamp, because with DataCamp, they can go and learn the technical skills that they're particularly interested in. Great, perfect. That helps everybody. That being said, if you're going to come through one of our programs, we're going to force you to learn the things that we know that you're going to need to know, which means you're going to have excellent SQL skills because that's how you're going to get data. You're going to use Excel because everybody has to use Excel. You're going to have to learn to give presentations, make great presentations. You're going to have to learn to talk to people and influence people. You're going to have to do those things because those are going to apply to no matter job, whatever job you want to. So there's a balance, if that makes sense.
Interesting. No, that's really helpful. And it feels like to get it back to duration, really, I suppose there is value in allowing people time to explore, but that can be purposefully designed. It's not just here's a bunch of time and you could have done this learning in a much shorter time. If you need time to explore and explore different ways of applying those skills and that's valuable use of time. But I suppose it does come down to what is the best use of the time that you have, and what is the absolute mandatory stuff that you need to put into a course to ensure that you are employable, that you can do that job.
That's exactly it. And so what we've done is moved a lot of that like more exploratory stuff out of the core program when it's intensive, when we're trying to get you through and trained up to a certain level, and into that post-graduation part, which we call Accelerate, where then you have more time to like try different things, work on different projects, research different industries, look at different jobs, like all of that kind of stuff, which can happen much more at your own pace and on your own time.
James Cotton, thank you very much for an exploration of duration in learning. It's been a fascinating conversation, and super excited to see where you go with iOsphere, because it does sound like you've developed a model that is certainly a very interesting alternative to the traditional view of duration in learning. So thank you, Phil, for questions, and thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.